Hello everyone, I'm Matt Carvalho, and with me is my guest at this time, State Representative and candidate for Lieutenant Governor of Rhode Island, Aaron Regunberg. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm pretty good. Thank you for being here today.
Absolutely.
Well, my first question is quite general. What is it that made you want to get into politics?
That's a great question. So I got involved in politics originally through community organizing, and specifically through youth organizing, which is why I was excited when I heard about your work as a high school student who wants to get involved and really engage in the political process. So I founded an organization here in Providence called the Providence Student Union to help young people come together and make their voices heard. And it was working with young people, helping them win real changes in their schools, healthier lunches, better approach to standardized testing, free bus passes so kids can actually get to class instead of having to walk 3 miles through the snow and rain to get to school, which is what the previous policy was. So I was working on issues like that with awesome young people and parents and teachers and families. That really it taught me that big change is possible when voices from the community actually have a say in the decisions that impact them. So that's sort of what inspired me to run for state representative back in 2014.
And as a young adult, as a millennial, what kind of advice would you give to someone, say, like another youth, about getting into politics and kind of go through that process?
Well, I think we desperately need more young people involved in politics. So I'm always encouraging young people to really think about, first of all, getting involved in campaigns and thinking about running for office themselves someday. The political decisions that get made today are going to impact our generation for a really long time. And there's that old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I think that our generation has some really important perspectives on the future of our planet, on how our economy is working, particularly for folks at the bottom, and so we need to be represented in that. So I think the other thing, young people have some real advantages in getting involved in campaigns because we've got the energy, we've got the new ideas, and so I remember when I was first running for state representative, I'd knock on a door, and sometimes someone would say, "How old are you? And you want me to vote for you?" And the response I'd often give, and I would recommend this to other young people who might be in the same position, is, I was 24 at the time, so I'm 24, but I've been up to the State House, and the problem up there has never seemed to me that there's too much new energy and new ideas. It seems like it's the opposite, and people would usually be like, "Oh yeah, that's right. Like we do need something new to shake it up." So I think that there's a lot of opportunities that folks in our generation have to really try to make the system better.
Now, recently, some Rhode Island legislatures introduced the Fair Shot agenda. What are your thoughts on that, and do you think it will be able to work?
So I've been a big organizer in helping my colleagues come together around a collective agenda. So we last year for the first time we tried this. We called it the Fair Shot Agenda. So for bold but common sense proposals that can actually make government work for everyday working people. And we had a whole lot of people come out last year. I was excited. Just yesterday we had the rollout, and we had even more reps coming together. So I think it shows that there's a lot of us who have a real commitment to fighting to level the playing field, to make sure that the system is not just working for the wealthy and the well-connected folks who can afford to hire a corporate well-connected state house lobbyist. We need to make sure government works for folks who can't afford that as well. And so this agenda, which includes things like a budget that protects our neighbors, investment in school facility repairs so kids aren't going to school or buildings that are falling apart, fighting for fair wages and pay equity for everyone so you're not working 50, 60, 70 hours a week and still can't afford the basics because of poverty wages, and justice and support for our seniors so that they can age in dignity. so we can have affordable, accessible long-term care, so that we can bring down the cost of prescription drugs, which can be such a big challenge for a lot of people. Everywhere I go, I hear stories from people who have to choose between their medications and their groceries or paying the bills. That is so unacceptable. At the same time as big pharmaceutical corporations are raking in the profits. So there's things we can do as a state to level that playing field, to make sure that everyone has a fair shot. I'm excited to know that a bunch of my colleagues have come together, and we're going to be working together to push this agenda forward.
Now, last year when you introduced the same agenda, there were certain things that are missing that are on this one, like the paid sick leave, which you got passed in the state. When you did that, what were your thoughts on the whole process and the process of getting that bill through, and how it felt to get it finished for the people of Rhode Island?
Yeah, so I am really proud to have been able to help lead the fight to pass legislation guaranteeing paid sick days for over 100,000 Rhode Islanders who never before had that security. It's something that's personal to me as someone who was raised by a single mom and really grew up learning that we need policies that support families of all kinds. And the number of people in my district who I've heard from who don't have paid sick days, and so when their kid is sick, they're making that choice: do I send my kid to school sick, or do I risk my job or my paycheck? Folks who are caring for an elderly parent and they need to help them get to the doctor, but they can't because it would risk their job. So it's just basic security for families that it was a big uphill battle. There was a lot of opposition from some of the the more powerful, the Walmarts, the big corporations. But I was proud that we were able to bring different stakeholders together from the business community, workers, and get to a piece of legislation that's going to make a real difference in people's lives. And I think it also shows that the power of that collective advocacy, having a bunch of reps come forward and say we're going to support this. Having a big part of why that policy passed was because so many Rhode Islanders weighed in. We had over 7,000 Rhode Islanders who called their legislators, who wrote their legislators an email or a postcard or a note. And so it's that kind of grassroots activism that really does make a difference in the legislative process.
Now, speaking of job security, there is one particular corporation which jobs aren't looking to secure right now, including my own, with the entire issues with Paw Sox. And
do you work there?
I do work there. I work
Nice.
in McCoy Stadium, cook in the back. What are your thoughts on the entire Paw Sox issues, and what are you going to try to do as a state rep and as lieutenant governor to try to keep the Paw Sox in Rhode Island and keep those hundreds of jobs here in Rhode Island?
So I think we all want to do everything we can to make sure that Paw Sox stay in our state. I mean, it's such a critical part of our culture, our pride. It's such a fixture for the community of Pawtucket, and for folks like you that are getting opportunities there. And so I think in my approach to the issue, we need to figure out the right balance that's going to give the public and taxpayers a sense of accountability, to make sure that there's a lot of people who obviously they feel burned from 38 studios, and the idea of public investment for a private venture that's owned by millionaires and billionaires, people get nervous about that. And so what I've been, my approach to the issue has been, what are the mechanisms that we can put into the legislation, into the language, to make sure that there is that accountability. So, for example, one point that I've heard from a lot of people is concern. Rhode Islanders don't want to feel duped, and so I've heard concern from people that there's the team has a certain value now, the new stadium moves forward, and that value increases, and concern that then the team owners turn around and flip it at a big profit. That sort of the public made possible. And so I've been trying to float the idea of, could we put in language to simply have a provision that if the owners turn around to flip the team at a big profit for a certain period of time after this deal goes through, the state of Rhode Island gets some cut of that proceeds. So I think there are things like that that we can make sure that the public feels that there is accountability, that they have a voice at the table, and I think that's going to be necessary to ultimately get a deal over the finish line.
Now, another big issue here in the state is with the entire UHIP issue. What are your thoughts on UHIP, and what do you think should be done? Should we get rid of it? Should we try to fix it? What do you think should be done with UHIP?
I mean, unfortunately, I think we're too far down the hole now to get rid of it. I think it really shows the problems and mistakes that were much earlier on. We shouldn't have made that transition to the system until we were ready. We shouldn't have been laying off the actual human beings who were taking calls and doing the work before we were ready. So there were some major mistakes made. At this point, we need to continue to keep the pressure on and accountability on the administration to fill that backlog and respond to the system. But I think it's a good example of the valuable role that an activist lieutenant governor could have. For me, I foresee, I'm envisioning that office as a real independent public advocate. It can be an advocate for all the folks that right now are not getting heard and can't afford that kind of connected state house lobbyists. And so that applies to the legislature, but it also applies to the administration to have an extra watchdog that's going to keep the administration honest, that's going to point out when there are issues like what we just talked about with the beginnings of UHIP, when there were warning signs, but no one was talking about them.
Now, when you announced your bid for lieutenant governor, you said you wanted to be the people's lobbyist. How do you intend to be the people's lobbyist, and what are your main plans when you first step into the office, and what's your first initiatives when you get in to get done for the people?
So as I mentioned before, what's frustrated me about how the system works right now is that the most wealthy, the most well-connected institutions in our state, they can afford to hire these teams of corporate lobbyists and attorneys to make sure that they are heard in every room of the State House, every hallway, every fundraiser, while everyday Rhode Islanders who can't have that kind of representation, they get ignored. And so I think the idea of having a statewide elected official who's got that clear focus, who says, it's my job to be a voice for all those folks who can't afford the corporate state house lobbyist, who's going to use the resources of that office to organize, to bring people together, to open up the system and make it accessible. I think there's some really game-changing value there. And I'll give you one example. So I've been working on a legislative package this year to try to just overcome some of the basic barriers for people to be able to get up to the State House and make their voice heard that exist right now. So taking a bunch of the practical obstacles, things like parking. Let's have some public parking spaces so you don't have to walk a mile and a half or get a parking ticket to get to the State House, which is something I hear a lot. Things like childcare. The number of times I've heard people with parental responsibilities who come to the State House to testify, but then they have to leave early in order to get back to their families. Let's make it easier for them. To say that when you're testifying in a committee hearing, the first 10 spots where you sign up, those should be reserved for actual members of the public versus paid lobbyists. Things like investing in technology so that, like a lot of other states have done, so you can have some remote access. There are simple things we can do to open up the system and make it accessible, and I think the role of the lieutenant governor is really to take a lead in that fight, to turn that office into a public organizing base, to bring people in and show them how they can plug into the system.
Now, what are your thoughts on the job performance of the incumbent Lieutenant Governor Danny McKee?
So I'll say first of all, my focus in this race is really talking about our positive vision versus talking about anyone else. So that's the primary focus. I mean, I think there's some big differences between myself in the incumbent. When it comes to values and priorities, I'm a big believer in fighting for a living wage for all Rhode Islanders. He's opposed to that. I was a big supporter of, as you know, paid sick time. He opposed that. So, the idea of making government work for working families and fighting for economic justice, um, fighting for bold climate action, fighting for reproductive justice, fighting for gun violence prevention. There's some big contrasts on those issues, and I think there's a different approach for how you use that office. Again, I see that office as having a lot of potential to be that independent public advocate, and I think we haven't seen that kind of approach from the current lieutenant governor.
Now, there are quite a few differences from the job of the lieutenant governor and the job of the governor. But when people go to vote for lieutenant governor, in a way, they're also voting for the governor. Now, if you become lieutenant governor, if anything happens to the incumbent governor, if resigns or, God forbid, any health issues, if you become the governor, what do you plan on doing as governor to make sure people can trust you as a young kid getting into the leadership of the whole state, and what do you plan to do for the state as governor?
Well, first of all, I'd say, I'm really excited about the role of lieutenant governor. I absolutely feel ready to step up if the need happens, God forbid, as you said. And I wouldn't be in this race if I didn't. And I think I've demonstrated that capacity by my work in the legislature, the ability to bring people together and win some really big policy change that a lot of pundits didn't think were possible. But at the same time, I think the lieutenant governor's office, it can't just be about sitting around and waiting. We've got real challenges now in Rhode Island, and so we need someone who's going to use that office and all the potential it has to really put Rhode Islanders' voices front and center.
Now, going from state level to federal level problems, the first question I'd like to ask is, what are your thoughts on the incumbent president, Donald Trump, and his job performance and his administration?
I think that this is the most terrifying and radical administration in American history. I mean, I think I'm really scared about the damage that this administration is causing every single day. Whether it's fighting for millionaires and billionaires in ways that are going to cripple working families, whether it's shredding every piece of action and leadership we've taken on the existential crisis of climate change, which is going to be impacting us for a long, long time, and particularly here in Rhode Island, where we are the ocean state and we're so vulnerable to sea level rise. The attacks on healthcare for people, the attacks on our immigrant neighbors, who we've had a Rhode Islander, Lillian Calderon, from Johnston, who's been detained by ICE for weeks and kept away from her family. And she's a business owner. She's a great addition to our Rhode Island community. There's no reason we should be tearing families apart. So, to say nothing of just the erratic behavior that we see and having that with their thumb on the nuclear arsenal button, I think it's really, really important that the Democratic Party win back some levers to have some checks and balances and accountability. And I think it's incredibly important that we're doing everything we can at the state level to use the tools at our disposal in state government to protect our rights, protect our communities from these attacks that we're seeing out of Washington every day.
I wanted to get your thoughts on the recent government shutdown this morning and the reopening of it this morning, and what do you think needs to be done to prevent this from being a regular monthly thing from happening with our government?
I think the Democratic Party needs to win back control of the House. I think that we've got united Republican control right now, House, Senate, and the White House that can't run a functioning government. And so I think we need to do what we can in 2018 to have that check and balance.
And now, there's been a lot of talks and issues with healthcare, the Affordable Care Act. What do you think should be done with the entire healthcare issue? What method do you think we should use in order for people to get the healthcare that they need?
So we first of all need to protect the Affordable Care Act. Republicans continue to try to attack those gains that we've made. But I think we also need to go further. Every year since I've been elected, I've introduced legislation to create a single-payer Medicare for all style healthcare system in Rhode Island. Because ultimately, we need to get to universal coverage. I believe that healthcare should be a fundamental human right, not a privilege just for those who can afford it. And so I think creating a system that catches us up with every other developed country in the world, which uses a single-payer model, and says that healthcare should not be built based on corporate profits. It should be built based on thinking about healthcare and patient needs. That's where we ultimately need to go. There's obviously some very powerful special interests that are going to fight to stop that because the system is working well. For pharmaceutical companies that are making gangbuster profits, the system is working pretty well. It's just not working well for a lot of Rhode Islanders who are dealing with premiums that are too high. They're dealing with deductibles that make them put off needed care. They're dealing with caps. And so I'm going to continue to push for universal coverage because I think that's where we need to get to.
My last question on this. On more of a fun note, recently a Rhode Island lawmaker proposed to abolish many of the Rhode Island blue laws. I wanted to ask your thoughts first. I couldn't find the name of who that was. If you could say who that was, and also what are your thoughts on getting rid of the blue laws here in the state?
I'm not sure who put that legislation in. This is actually the first I'm hearing about it.
When I read the article, it was one of the state, one of the House leaders. I want to say it was the majority whip. I don't remember his name, but I believe it was the majority whip. I know I read it down. I believe the Projo.
Interesting. Well, you should send that over to me because I'd love to take a look at that.
I'll send it to you then.
And that's for me, but really appreciate it, Matt. Thanks for having me. Sorry about this that I have to